right now. So anyway, my name is Jason Anderson. It's so good to be here. This is step by step through the FAFSA. And so it's really important as we go through this that we kind of go through financial aid first, making sure that we have a good understanding of what that looks like. What does it look like to fund your education? And then we'll go through the FAFSA line by line. And then at the end, I'll give you some resources. So that's really kind of our agenda as we walk through this slide deck. But I do want to start with a disclaimer. So as Lisa had mentioned, I am a professor. I do teach for the University of Kansas, but they don't endorse this. And this is me wearing my grad metrics hat. This isn't me wearing my professor hat. So you should know that as we go through this slide deck. I just want to make it clear that although I have a day job with the University of Kansas, this is me doing my own thing here. And so that's an important piece. So again, I mentioned our agenda for today. We'll talk about financial aid, what it's like to fund college, what's available to you. We'll do an overview of the FAFSA, and then we'll do a step-by-step through the FAFSA. And then at the end, like I said, I'll give you some of my best resources to help you going forward as you start to fill this out October 1. And you might be wondering, who am I? So I am, well, Jason Anderson, as I had mentioned. The reason why I do have an expertise area in college planning and the FAFSA in particular, I helped a large financial institution here in the Kansas City area start a college planning program for their clients. And so I've been doing, well, I did that for around 3 years. Then obviously my entire career has been in higher education. I have a unique perspective because I am a professor and I've also been on the staff side at many institutions. And then I am a certified public accountant in the state of Kansas. So that gives me a unique financial perspective as well, especially when we start talking about taxes and things of that nature. Now, I don't work in tax every day. I'm not a tax expert, but I do have a unique financial perspective because of that credential that I bring to the table as well, in addition to some graduate degrees and things of that nature. But that's, and I'm gonna keep admitting people as they come in here. So if you hear some clicking, that's what I'm doing. So financial aid. College is expensive, right? So actually right now, if you were to go to many large state institutions, whether it be in Kansas or whether it be in Missouri, it's gonna run about $100,000 right now. And that inflates traditionally, it's somewhere between 5 and 8% every year. And so this can be, now I think COVID's actually gonna damper that a little bit because many schools are reluctant to increase their prices in this environment. But you're talking about a substantial investment. If you have multiple kids, then even more so. So what's offered in order to help you pay for that? Well, there's a couple entities that will reach out to offer funding to you. The first is the federal government, which is why you're on this phone call. It's the free application for federal student aid to qualify for certain aid. The next player in this equation that gives lots and lots of money every year, and really is probably the majority of the money that you're going to get for college, is the institution itself, giving you scholarships and other assistance from them as well. So we'll talk about both sides of that equation, and you are going to have to fill out the FAFSA in general terms to get both. Now, the school itself might have an additional application, whether that be a proprietary form that they use or something like the CSS profile, which will gather additional information in your financial situation. But generally, almost every school is going to ask you to fill out the FAFSA. The FAFSA gives them your financial information, and then the schools can go about compiling all this aid that you're eligible for, both from the government and then from the institution itself. So what's offered specifically from the FAFSA? Well, there's grants, and grants equal free money. This is money that you don't have to pay back. So you might have heard of, for instance, the Pell Grant, or if your student wants to be a teacher, there's the Teach Grant. There's also like we'll talk about the FSEOG grant. So many grants out there, even more that we'll look at here in a couple slides. There's also scholarships that are available. Again, that's coming from the institution itself, but they're going to use the information that you put in the FAFSA to see if you qualify in many cases, especially if it's financial need-based aid that the school is giving you. So they want to know if you have financial need for college. We'll talk about what that means here in a second. Work study. This is where a school offers you a job, so it's not guaranteed. Your student still has to interview for that job. There has to be a job that's open, but then the federal government in turn actually pays for that job. And so it is still federal assistance, and you have to qualify for it based on financial need. Then we have loans, which this is probably the largest chunk of money that you can be offered by the government. It also depends on the status of your student, how much you're going to get, and then also depends on the year that they're in school. So interestingly enough, they'll start out at typically about $5,500 in subsidized and unsubsidized loans, and then they'll go up from there. So they'll add a little bit the next year, a little bit the next year, until you get up to about $7,000 or $7,500. So this number increases over time. It ends up being about $21,000 in loans that are offered to your student, which is actually pretty incredible if you think about it for a couple reasons. One, interest rates are historically low on this debt that the government is offering, so that's a plus. The second piece is that it's offered to your student probably when they don't have a credit score, probably when they don't have hardly any income and assets. And so this is subsidized in the sense that the government's giving a loan that the private sector probably would not. So these loans come in a couple different flavors, but the two that will be offered to your student, depending on your financial need, will be subsidized or unsubsidized. And what the central difference between these two numbers is, subsidized means the government's going to pay for that interest while your student is in school. So no interest is going to be accruing while they're in school. The government's going to pay for that. Whereas unsubsidized, the interest is going to start accruing, right? Now, I had mentioned that this is historically low. We're talking about debt that's going to be in like the 2%, which is pretty incredible, but it still will accrue if you have unsubsidized loans. And like I said, that's traditionally going to be about $5,500 for the first year, $6,500 for the second year. Subsequent years will go up to about $7,000 or $7,500. It's about $21,000 that you'll be offered in these loans. And I say you as in your student. This will go in the student's name. But you might also be offered, parents, I assume many are parents on this call, parents will be offered what's called a Parent Plus loan if you qualify for it. So if you demonstrate financial need based on what you filled out in the FAFSA, the government might offer you what I call a gap loan. So they're going to say, what can they afford to pay each year for college? How much aid are they getting from the school and the government? If there's any gap between that and the full cost of attendance, which would include things like tuition, but also room and board, books, personal expenses, transportation expenses, and this is calculated by each school, then you might be offered an additional loan from the government. It is contingent on a credit check. So the government for the parents will put you through a credit check. It's also higher interest, but it is an opportunity to take out a loan at a low interest rate for, well, relatively low interest rate for your student to go to school if you don't have all the funds that you need. So you could be offered some more money, the parents specifically, when you fill out the FAFSA. So we talked about money from the government versus money from the school. And then private scholarships is another bucket of money, but I do like to tell families that I talk with about this. This is where you would go to maybe FastWeb, for instance, and apply for a bunch of private scholarships from private entities, nonprofits, maybe social clubs, things like that. This is a very small piece of the pie when it comes to money. We're talking somewhere between 2.5% to 5%. And so keep that in mind, that a lot of families think they're going to apply for private scholarships and they're going to find a lot of money there. Generally, that's not my experience when I work with families. They go out, they apply, they don't get a lot. And so where you're going to get the majority of your money is from the government and from the institution itself, okay? So that's Financial Aid 101. How do you qualify for federal financial aid, which is what you're applying for when you fill out the FAFSA? Well, you have to be a US citizen or an eligible non-citizen. You have to have a social security number, and you have to be registered with the Selective Service if you're a male. And if you are a male and you're not registered for the Selective Service at this time, you can actually do that through the FAFSA when it asks this question. You have to be enrolled in an eligible degree or certificate program. This is also a hang-up for some students because maybe they want to enroll, but not necessarily in a certificate program, or just want to take classes. You can't do that. You have to be working towards a degree or a certificate. One of the reasons for that is because the Department of Education doesn't want to give you money if you're not making what's called satisfactory academic progress towards a degree. They don't want taxpayer dollars just going to having fun taking classes. They want there to be an actual outcome, right? And so you do have to be in a degree or certificate program to be eligible for federal financial aid. You also have to have some type of high school diploma or equivalent, whether that be GED or homeschool completion. And then you have to be enrolled a specific time, half time in this case, and that would be defined by the school and your program, what that looks like. So how much can you get? If we look at the Pell Grant, this year it typically goes up with inflation, but right now, 1920, and we're actually, what you're gonna be applying for probably on this call is a 2021, 2022 FAFSA. And by the way, if that's confusing to you, the FAFSA is named after the year that you're gonna enter school. So if you're filling out this upcoming October FAFSA, October 1, it's the 2021, 2022. Well, that's when your student would go off to school in the fall, okay? And I'm gonna admit somebody else here. So keep that in mind. That's why it's named that, and then you're gonna use the 2019 tax information. So we'll get to that here in a second. But the federal supplemental educational opportunity grant, I had mentioned that earlier, up to 4,000, teach grant up to 4,000. There's the Iran and Afghanistan service grant that can also be up to the Pell amount. Direct subsidized loans, I had mentioned first year, it's typically 5,500. Direct unsubsidized loans, it says 20,500, but this is generally if you were an independent student, and we'll get to that here in a second, but most of the people on this call, if you're a first-time freshman and your kid's going off to school, they're gonna be a dependent student. We can talk about the criteria for the FAFSA to make your student an independent student, but generally that's not gonna be the case for most families. And so this would be rather limited compared to that 20,500. That'd be more if you were an independent student. And then Direct Plus, again, I had mentioned that this is a loan that could go to parents, and this would be your kind of cost of attendance versus financial aid. And if there's a gap there, the government might give the parents a loan in their name. And I don't see any questions at this point, but if there are any questions, again, feel free to put them in the chat box. I'm happy to stop and answer some questions as we go along, but we'll keep moving until you all tell me to stop and answer a question. So now we're gonna get into the nuts and bolts of the FAFSA. That's why you all came here. And the cool thing about this and why I love doing this presentation in the community is we're gonna go through it step by step. And I can tell you the FAFSA is complicated, right? It's not a fun thing to fill out. People don't like it, but it's a lot easier than it used to be. And there are tools to help you, and I'm gonna show you what those tools are so you're not gonna feel lost throughout this process, okay? So we'll get to that as we go through this. We're gonna do it step by step. That's why it's called step by step. So the FAFSA stands for Free Application for Federal Student Aid. And what I want you to know there is that first word, free, okay? You should not pay for the FAFSA unless you want to. There are services out there, there are individuals that might help you fill it out, and they might charge you a fee. But generally, you do not have to pay anyone, well, you don't have to pay anyone to fill out the FAFSA. It's not a for charge application versus maybe something like the CSS profile, where you will have to pay for schools to get that information. But that's only for a specific number of schools, about 400 in the United States. The FAFSA is free. It's free for everyone. Free. So you shouldn't pay for it, right? And if you get to a website that it says, hey, get out your credit card and pay for the FAFSA, you're not on the right website, okay? So it is free. And the right website is fafsa.gov, Fafsa.gov. That will actually send you to another link. So don't get freaked out if it redirects you. It will redirect you to the studentaid.gov website where you'll start to fill it out. The other thing is that I want you to know about the FAFSA is it's the free application for federal student aid, not state student aid. And so some states use the FAFSA application for state aid and some do not. So what you want to do is you want to check with your state entity that is in charge of higher ed. And so like in Kansas, it'd be the Kansas Board of Regents. In Missouri, I believe it's the Missouri Department of Education. And they may have a separate application to fill out for state aid. But this is for federal aid. And like I said, some states use it, some states don't. Generally, your state applications, I put what generally Missouri and Kansas are. They haven't published the new dates yet, but generally Missouri wants you to have it filled out by about February, Kansas by about June. Okay? So you have some time for the state, and if you're filling it out in October or November or December, you're going to be meeting these deadlines. It's available October 1 every year for the coming year, and you do need to fill it out every year, generally speaking. And most schools will require this. So if you want to get aid, this application isn't good for 4 years. It's only good for a year. You have to fill it out 4 times, or maybe even 5 times, or maybe even 10 times if your kid's going to grad school, right? But you do have to fill this out every year. So it's available October 1. We're less than a month away. We're getting really close to the opening of the application. If your kid's going to be a senior in high school, this is probably why you're on the call, right? Tax information is from 2 years prior. The Department of Education changed this not too long ago because what was happening is families were getting to the FAFSA and they were scrambling. They were maybe hadn't filled out their tax application yet, and they were using 1 year prior. And so many families were not only stressed in filling out the FAFSA, they were stressed in finishing their taxes, and so it was a big mess. And so several years ago, the Department of Education said, no, we're going to do 2 years prior. So it should be done, right? You should have your taxes filed. That's the hope. And so, for instance, the 2021-2022 FAFSA that's coming up for you, if your kid's a senior in high school, it's going to use 2019 taxes. And then the whole idea behind the FAFSA, what's calculated is something called the expected family contribution. And this is a fake number, okay? This is essentially a guide number, a litmus test that the government wants to know generally, in theory, what you should be able to pay for your kid to go to college every year, what your family should be able to pay towards college every year after basic living expenses. And so again, this number may shock you. The government may say you should be able to pay for $80,000 a year to go to college, and you're like, with what money? Like, where have you seen my bank account? I have to pay a mortgage. I have to pay car loan payments, and things of that nature. And so again, this isn't a number that the government's going to ask you to write a check for. It's just their gauge of how much need you have to go to college, financial need. All right. But that's the number that's going to be calculated. You will be able to see that at the end of the FAFSA, what the application has said your expected family contribution is. All right, so it looks like I have a question. Let me get there. Yeah, sorry. Sorry for the background noise. I apologize. I might move here in a second, but this is unfortunately, there's not many places during COVID that you can actually get on and do a presentation. So I apologize. There is a little bit of background noise because I'm not the only one here. So hopefully it won't be too distracting, but trying to do the best I can. But thank you for letting me know that. I appreciate that. And I might be able to move a couple booths over and eliminate some of that noise. So I may do that here in a second. Any other questions as we continue on here? So what's reported? What's going to be reported on the FAFSA are income and assets, both for the parent and the student. And so income will come from your tax returns 2 years prior, or the tax returns that your income will come from. So you'll be able to import that from the IRS. Assets, on the other hand, will come, like your checking account, your savings account, will come as of the day that you fill out the FAFSA. And so there's 2 places where financial information is coming from. Some of it's historic from 2 years prior, and then some of it is as of today, like your checking and savings accounts. And that's for the parents and the student. Now, in order to fill out the FAFSA, you will have to essentially get and apply for an Fsa Id, both the student and at least one of the parents that's filling out information on the FAFSA. So the FAFSA form will require this, not only to enter it, so it's your entry, it's kind of your key to get into the FAFSA, but it's also what you need to have to sign the FAFSA at the very end. It's your electronic signature, essentially. And there's a process to get this. You can do that at studentaid.gov/FSAID. Okay? All right, now we get to step-by-step through the FAFSA. I'm gonna give about 10 minutes, or not 10 minutes, about 15 seconds or so if anybody has some questions, and I'm gonna move to a different a different location here to see if I can get rid of some of that background noise. All right, so hopefully that helped with a little bit of background noise. Thanks for letting me know about that. Sorry, like I said, trying to get all this done in a place that's safe in the age of COVID. So hopefully that will help. All right, so here is the login page. So when you go to fafsa.gov, this is the first page that you will see, and you'll have the option to either start or log in. So if you're a new user, you will have to start a new application. You'll hit start here. If you're a returning user, you can log in with your credentials. When you log in, you're either gonna say, I'm the student or I'm the parent. And this is an important note here, simply because the student this is really their form. When your student goes off to college, they are an adult in most cases legally. And so it's really their application. Now the parent does have to report information, and that's an important part of the process, but it's really the student driving here. And so if you pick, for instance, that you're a parent, it will spit you out in a specific portion of the form where you can help and fill out and assist your student, but that's really why there's this delineation here, is in the government's mind, this is your student's form, not the parent, which can be kind of confusing for parents, especially if they're footing the bill, but that's how the government sees it. So if you're a student, you can pick that, you can put in your Fsa Id, and that's how you will enter the form. Or you can pick I'm a parent, and in that case, you'll be doing first name, last name, your student's social security number, and then their date of birth, and going in through that direction. The first thing that you'll see is a disclaimer. This is a legal document, so to speak, and so there is a disclaimer about access to the secured government system, and so you'll accept that disclaimer. And then you'll get spit into the what I call like a dashboard page, which is right here for starting a new FAFSA. And you'll see when you log in that there's options here. This is another place where you can get tripped up and waste a lot of time. Is there's an application for 2021-2022 FAFSA or the 2020-2021 FAFSA. And the reason is because if I wanted to go to school right now and I'm maybe starting in spring, then I would still need to fill out this year's FAFSA. But for those of you that have a senior in high school and you're filling it out later down the line for their entry in August for the coming year, then you'll want to pick this 2021-2022 FAFSA. So again, keep in mind that it is the year that your student is going to enter in school. That's the FAFSA that you're going to fill out. You'll also be asked for a save key. Now, a save key is if you exit the application and you have a save key, your current application will be saved for 45 days. And so that's an important point to remember. It won't save it forever, but it will save it for a little while if you need to come back and fill this out. But you do need a save key. And so, by the way, this is another place to tell you these little question marks right here, you can see with, and I'm not sure if you can see my cursor right here, but it's a little question mark that's encircled by a blue circle. Those are helper text that you can click on and it will tell you exactly what you need to do. So for instance, for this, you're like, well, how long does my save key have to be? Does it need numbers or letters? If you click on that little helper icon, it will give you directions on exactly what your save key needs to be, okay? So keep that in mind as you go through harder questions through the FAFSA. You can always click on that little icon and get additional information. Then you'll have just kind of a FAQ section in the FAFSA. You can look through some of this if you want. You'll know a lot of it after this slide deck, but this is a place where you can get some of your questions answered if you want. Now I'm going to stop here because there's a specific piece that we need to know about the FAFSA in terms of the student. Now your student can either be classified as a dependent student or an independent student. And I want to tell you right now, don't think of these terms in terms of taxes, right? A student being dependent on you in terms of taxes is not the same definition or criteria in terms of the FAFSA. The FAFSA will guide you through some questions, and we'll see them here in a second. They will classify your student as either dependent or independent student. And what that means is that for a dependent student, they're going to have to report their parents' financial information. An independent student, the government is seeing as they are the ones and the only one that have to pay for college. So they only have to report their information. Like I said, for the majority of the people on this call, with my experience of the people that I do this workshop with, the majority of you are going to have a student that's dependent on you to go to college. And so we're gonna go through that scenario. But if you find yourself on this call and you're an independent student, then it may be a little bit different than what we're going to go through here. Like I said, the majority of folks that are in my workshops have parents that have students who are going to be classified as a dependent student in terms of the FAFSA. So we're going to go through that scenario. I see I've got another chat here. It says, I have a junior in college. If I do the FAFSA's freshman year and want to do funding for this year, do they also need to go back and do 1920? That's an excellent question for your financial aid office. If they're going to require you to fill out the FAFSA for the current year, then you'll have to fill it out before they're going to process your financial aid for that year. And so I would circle back with the school he's going to, you said his, so yeah, that he's going to, and I would ask them which FAFSA applications they want you to fill out in order to get the funding that you're looking for. But generally speaking, you're going to have to fill it out for the year that they're in school. So if he's going to be in school as in this year, the 1920 school year, then you'd have to fill that one out. 2021-22, you're obviously going to have to fill that one out. It's open October 1. Good question. All right, so dependent student. I'm going to stop right here because this is really where we get into the form. So there's a couple sections that we're going to walk through together. The first is student demographics. This is information for the student, demographic information. Then we're going to go to school selection. So your student's going to ask to put in the schools that they're interested in. And they don't have to fill them out all at one time. You can go back in and add additional ones. Like if you fill it out, submit it, and then they're like, oh, I want to go to Mizzou and I didn't put that in there. They can go back in and add it, and then that school will get your information. So this isn't one and done. You can come back and edit it, but they will have to select the schools that they want to go to in this section, so that those schools will get your financial information. Then you have dependency status, which again, we're going to go through those questions that the government's going to ask you to classify your student as dependent on you or independent in terms of the FAFSA. Then we'll have parent demographics, student financials. We'll also have parent financials, and then we'll sign and submit, and then you'll get a confirmation screen. So those are the main sections of the FAFSA. We're going to start here at student demographics. So most of this is pretty cut and dry. You're going to know the information, or your student's going to know the information: social security number, first name, middle initial, last name, date of birth. Then we're going to have an email address. This is an email address that your student should be checking regularly. They will get communications from the Department of Education, important communications to this email address. And so keep that in mind. They'll have to enter it once, enter it again, and then a telephone number if they would like. Permanent mailing address. And this is an important one too, because really a lot of schools, in-state schools, or state schools will charge in-state or out-of-state tuition. And so it's important that you put your residential address. If you have any questions, again, the helper text here will help you through deciding where is your permanent place of residence. But for most of you, maybe you've been at an address for multiple years. This will be kind of an easy question to answer on the specific piece that you're looking for. I had mentioned earlier that U.S. citizens we have to be a U.S. citizen or an eligible non-citizen to get financial aid. And so this is where it's going to ask you if you're a citizen or one of those other categories that maybe you'll be eligible for financial aid or you might not be. And then it also asks if you've been in the state that you reside in for at least 5 years. This might be kind of confusing, but it makes sense if you understand what the FAFSA is going for. Again, state residency is really important in terms of in-state or out-of-state tuition. And so most years, although residency requirements vary by state to state, most states, if you've been there at least 5 years, will see you as a bona fide resident of that state. And so it's essentially asking if you've been there for more than 5 years or at least 5 years, and that's going to answer, it's going to kind of say that you're a bona fide resident of that state for in-state, out-of-state purposes. We'll keep moving along here. Student information. High school diploma, again, I'd mentioned that you have to have some high school diploma or equivalent to be eligible for financial aid. So you're seeing that the application is asking those questions to see if you're eligible for financial aid. Another place where I see families mess up a lot is college degree or certificate, what we'd be working on in the 2020-21 school year. Even if your student has taken dual credit classes or maybe gone to Johnson County Community College or Metropolitan Community College and picked up a few college classes, they are what's considered a never attended college and first year student. So if you go down to this final drop down box down here, that's what they're going to want to select here. So they're going to be working towards, let's say, a bachelor's degree or an associate's degree, et cetera, but they will be a first year student in terms of financial aid, even if they've gotten dual credit. And then work study is another question here, and you can say whether you're interested, not interested, or don't know in terms of work study. I would encourage you just to put yes or don't know here so that you're going to remain eligible if you get work study down the line, if you're eligible for it through the Fafsa. Again, I had mentioned that those are jobs on campus that are funded by the government. So you always want to keep that eligibility. Your student doesn't have to apply for those jobs and actually pull the trigger on that. But it's good to be eligible and to say that you're eligible, just to know if you qualify for it or not. They have to select whether they're male or female, and one of the main reasons here is for selective service. And so if you're a male, you do have to register for selective service. Again, you'll see that if you put no here, that you'll be given the option to register through the Fafsa, which is kind of a unique feature and nice if you're not registered and want to register. You can do it straight here. It asks for a driver's license in state. This isn't required information. So if you don't want to put it in, you don't have to. It won't affect your aid eligibility, but it does ask for it at this time. It also asks if you're foster care and the highest completion status of the two parents that will be filling out the Fafsa. And again, those last two in particular aren't going to have an effect on financial aid. But they are asked by the government for probably statistical purposes is my guess, but it's not gonna affect your eligibility. And then we're on to the next section, which is school selection. So this is where your student is going to select their high school and then also select the schools that they wanna go to school in. And there is a limit in the number, I believe it's 10. I haven't double checked that this year, but I believe it's 10 schools, 10 or 15. That your student is able to select here. If you have more than that, and sometimes that happens, it's not very often, but if you do have more schools than what's allowed, you can always submit it and then go back and edit some of those schools. You can add the additional ones. And like I said, that does happen from time to time, but not often. So they're going to select the name of the high school. They'll be able to look it up in a database and select which high school they're coming from. And then you'll start adding schools that your student is interested in. And so there's a couple ways to do that. One is each school has what's called a federal school code. And so you can look that up on the school's website. You know, let's say Rockhurst is a 6-digit code. You can enter it here, it will automatically look it up. Or you can just look it up in a database, which is a lot easier for most families. Let's say you're looking at Drury, you just put Springfield and Missouri, and then you find Drury on the list and you select it. So that's where you'll select the school. You will tell the school whether you plan to go on campus, off campus. This helps them calculate the full cost of attendance that we were talking about earlier. And then you'll just add as many schools as you want. You'll select all those schools and then you'll move on to dependency status, which is our third section that we're going to go through here. Any questions at this point? We've covered the first two sections. Any questions as we move along here? All right, I'll keep moving. So dependency status is the next section. And again, the government wants to know whether the student is going to be kind of dependent on you in terms of their finances, or whether they're going to be standing alone in terms of their finances. And so there are specific questions that will make your student either dependent or not dependent on you. And like I said, don't think of this in terms of whether they're dependent on my tax return or dependent in some other way. The government has their own criteria and you've got to play by their rules. And so you can't really just say, oh, well, I'm not going to support them at all, so they're independent. That's not the criteria the government uses. And so and you'll see as we go through these questions, what are those criteria? So the first one is whether your student's married or not. If your student is married, by the time they go to college, they're automatically considered independent of you, as you might imagine. They've established their own household, and so they're going to be using their own finances for college. And so if your student is already married, they're going to be considered independent. They won't have to enter parent financial information. More questions, and I won't go in detail on all of these, but these are the independency question criteria. So one is, do you have children that you support? Another is, do you have dependents? Again, this would be a situation where maybe they've already kind of started their own family unit, and that would indicate to the government that they have their own financial situation in terms of paying for college. Also, armed services, veteran status, and foster care would be another criteria. Being an emancipated minor would be a criteria that would make you independent, etc. So these are some of, and the reason why they're in checkbox form is because these are obviously less common than the previous questions. So when you get through all of this, oh, and homeless is another question that they asked too. Once you get through all these questions, the FAFSA will throw this screen at you, and it will tell you whether you've been qualified as a dependent or an independent student at this point in the process. You can see here, I'm going through the slides that will show you dependent status, and so that's what it shows us here. And if you're dependent, again, I told you need to enter your parents' financial information, and so it will ask you, do you want to provide information about your parents? Of course you do, because it's required. If you're unable to do that, it throws you into kind of a different bucket where your financial aid is limited in terms of what you'll qualify for. So most families, again, will select, I'll provide information from my parents. At that point, they say, hey, well, we got to gather information from parents. So they go into the next section, which is parent demographics. And they will ask you if you're married. The reason for this is they're trying to figure out whose financial information needs to be reported. Many families at this point say, well, I'm divorced, not remarried, or I'm divorced and married. Who does that, so whose information do I report? Is it maybe the person that they spend the most time with or that's supported most financially? And again, the government has its own criteria here. It's not necessarily something that you're able to, well, it's not something you're able to decide on your own. You have to go by the government's rules. And so if there's any situations like that, I'm happy to go through that criteria. It's generally who they're spending the most time with. And if that's a clear winner, then that's who's reporting information. And if it's not a clear winner in terms of time, it's a 50-50 split, then it's who supports them most financially. Those are the general rules. But again, I can talk through specific situations if that's of interest. You'll state when you got married, and then you'll go into the parents' information, whether that's one parent or two parents. And so similar to the questions that we just saw for students, social security number, last name, first name, date of birth, parents' email address, parents' social. And one of the weird things, it's kind of strange, but the government on the parent section doesn't ask for a full first name. They just ask for a first initial. So that's something that's kind of quirky about the form. I'm not really sure why they don't just ask for the full first name, but that's what the wording asks us to do. And so there it is. The last four, date of birth for the parent. They'll again ask if you've been in the state of residency for at least 5 years. We went over why the government asked for that. And then we go to household size. So the government, this expected family contribution number can be split and modified based on how many are in your household, how many go to school at one time. And so this is an important piece that you want to pay attention to. So it's going to ask you about parents, how many parents are in the household. It'll ask for yourself to qualify the student as a person in the household. And then it says, do you have any others that are living in the household? And it will give you the criteria for that, ABC. Then we'll look at the number of parents in the house. Well, it will automatically calculate the household size. And then you'll put how many are in college for the 2021-2022 school year. So if you have multiple students that are going to college, multiple children, you would notate that here. And again, this is to help calculate EFC because it can be modified based on household, how many people are going to college. Then we'll continue on in parent financial information, but this is an important part. So one of the real challenges in the FAFSA, especially historically, is you had to go to your tax returns. You had to calculate all these numbers based on different lines in your 1040 tax return. And then it's just really cumbersome and confusing, really complex, not a fun process, right? It felt like you were trying to be a CPA on this thing. It was just, you know, most people do not want to do that type of work. And so what happened a while ago, and this was taken offline a few years ago, but it's back, is that you can import your information directly from the IRS if you had certain filing status. And so not everyone qualifies for this. And if you don't qualify for it, the FAFSA will tell you you don't qualify. You have to enter these in manually. Not fun. But a lot of families do qualify to import their information directly from the IRS. That's called the IRS data retrieval tool. And so at this point in the process, you'll enter in your tax information. If you already completed your tax returns, what type of tax return did you have? And then it will say link to the IRS. And so at that point, you'll get the opportunity to use the IRS data retrieval tool, if you qualify, to pull your information directly from the IRS. And it will go to a separate screen. You'll confirm some information with the IRS. You'll confirm that you want to import the information, and then all that will be automatically filled in for you on the FAFSA, which is a huge win for families that, again, don't want to do all these manual calculations that you used to have to do on the FAFSA. Then we'll go into financial information. Again, some of this might be pre-filled if you have filled out the information or if it's been imported from the IRS data retrieval tool, okay? So you may not have to fill out all these, but we'll go through them just to show you what you're gonna have to expect when you fill out this form come October 1. So it'll ask for your adjusted gross income, and it will tell you what line that comes from on your tax return. It will ask you, if you're in a two-parent situation, how much was made by one spouse versus how much was made by the other spouse. And so sometimes that's really easy. If you're W-2'd, you can kind of just figure that out pretty seamlessly. Sometimes it's a little more complex. Like for instance, if you have multiple occupations or independent contractor, or maybe like investment income, things of that nature, might be a little more complex here. But hopefully you're in a situation where it won't be too complex for you. That's my hope. And it looks like I have a question, so let me make sure that I'm answering all those. If you have 2 or more children in college, is there a way to enter parent info one time and have it connected to both children's FAFSA applications? Yes, I have heard that that will occur. I can't verify that because I've never worked through that specific scenario with a family in front of a screen, but that is what I've heard, that there is a way to connect to that. So again, that's been what I've heard, my experience. I haven't walked through with a family in that specific scenario. But that's what I've heard. Good question. Then you'll continue on in parent financials. You'll answer a number of questions that may seem odd or strange, but it's going to ask you if you're a dislocated worker, for instance. It's going to ask you if you're on any federal assistance. Again, it's starting to gauge your financial need based on maybe some of the programs that you qualify for. So I know some families are like, well, why are they asking me these questions? It's because these are criteria the government's looking at to see if you have financial need for college. Then you'll have income tax. And again, some of this might be imported if you're using the IRS data retrieval tool, but it will ask you for the amount of tax that you've paid. And then you'll have more specialized situations. So I have worked with many, many families that are going to have 0 on all these categories. But you may have some of these categories that apply to you. And so you'll just want to read through them line by line to see if any of these qualify for your specific situation. So for instance, do you get special combat pay? Do you have education credits that you've taken? Student and college scholarships, so free education assistance, things of that nature, untaxed portions of IRAs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it will also ask you about tax exempt interest income. You'll keep going through all these lines, federal federal work study, need-based programs, child support is another question that it's going to ask about, earning from cooperative education programs. Again, many of these things don't apply to many families, but sometimes they do. And if they do, you'll want to fill out this information. And I will tell you, if you're not working with somebody that is maybe more of an expert in the FAFSA or can guide you through that, again, these question marks that are encircled by the blue circles are really, really excellent places to start to get additional information on each of these questions. So if you're like, I don't even know what that is, can you give me more information? Click on one of those help icons, and it will give you additional guidance on each of these questions. All right, so after we get, I had mentioned earlier in the slide deck that the government is going to want to gather information from two different places. One is historic information from your tax returns, which is what we just went through, right? Hopefully it's imported from the IRS data retrieval tool, but if it's not, it will be a situation where you'll be going through your tax return lines and finding some specific items to report. But there is information that the government wants as of today. And so they want to know what is the balance. And that's where we get into this information about checking accounts, savings accounts, real estate, businesses, investments, things of that nature. They want to know balances as of today. So again, some of it is historical information, some of it's as of today. So it will ask if you want to report information about assets. You will want to report information about the assets, and sometimes it will automatically kind of pre-fill some of these answers depending on, or pre-fill some of these answers depending on your previous submissions. But what it's going to ask is it's going to ask for current balance as of today, and you'll see these questions have, again, that information that asks as of today. It's not the historical information from your tax return. What's your total current balances in cash, savings, checking accounts? So you want to log into your banking institutions, your credit union, look at those. As of today, what's the net worth in investments, including real estate? Now, let me stop you here. If you don't remember anything in this entire presentation, you need to look at the helper text on this specific question. There are massive exclusions as to what the government wants you to report here. And so, for instance, the government is not in the business of wanting you to liquidate your retirement account to pay for college. And so retirement accounts are something that you wouldn't report here, generally speaking. Again, look at the specific guidance under this question, but it's, like I said, substantial areas that the government doesn't want you to report on. So if you report those here, you're actually going to overstate your financial need, and you may penalize your student in what they qualify for. So if there's nothing else that you learn from this slide deck, please pay attention on this question, read the helper text, make sure what you're reporting is actually something that the government wants you to report, okay? So remember that. On investments, look at the helper text. You don't want to penalize your student here. And then today, it says as of today, look at current business valuations, investment firm valuations. Again, massive exclusions here. So if you do own a business, read the helper text, make sure that your business qualifies to be reported here. If it doesn't, you don't have to report it. And especially when it comes to businesses, massive exclusions. Investment farms, massive exclusions if you're working just like kind of like a household farm, that type of thing. So pay attention there. Helper text on these sections are extremely important. I wanted to point that out. It's hard to overstate because a lot of families do mess up right there. And then we get into student financials. So the great thing is they're going to ask essentially the same thing of the student that we just covered for parents. Again, the IRS data retrieval tool is a tool that you can use here. And so please use that for your student if that's applicable. But they're essentially going to go through the same criteria for your student, looking at their historical money that they've made in their tax return, if anything, and then looking at their assets and things like checking accounts, if they had any investments that were attached to them, etc. So you'll see that many of these questions are similar to what we've seen previously. You're going to put in your status on the tax returns, use the IRS data retrieval tool if that's something you qualify for, entering in adjusted gross income, looking at earnings from wages, tips, etc. Again, that's maybe where parents had to split that out between the two. With the student, you're not going to have to split it because it's just going to be you. Income tax that you've paid, some of those special circumstances that we discussed previously, same thing. Child support, earnings from cooperative education programs, etc. These are the more rare situations that we might have to go through. And then again, they're going to ask, as of today, what are balances in checking, savings, checking accounts? Do they have investments? Again, you need to check the helper text to make sure that things are qualified here. I will also put in a note here when it comes to 529 accounts. There's a specific place that you need to report those, whether it's the student or the parent. And so again, there's guidance there on how to do that. You don't want to double report some of those assets. And then net worth, if they had business or an investment farm, that's pretty rare. I was assuming it has to be extremely rare, but it does ask the same questions there. And then we're sign and submit. So the good thing is we're essentially through the FAFSA now. We're to the place where we're going to review and submit our application. So one of the questions that I'd ask you here is there a preparer that's helped you? So if you do pay someone to help you through the FAFSA, whether that be your accountant or a college consultant or what have you, even some online providers, for instance, you would need to submit information on that preparer because the government wants to collect that information. Then it's going to give you a summary of everything that you've entered up to this point. So you want to review that for accuracy. And then we'll go to sign and submit. And like I said, the student's going to have to sign because this is their form. And then at least one of the parents is going to have to sign to verify the parent information. Again, this is where you're going to use your FSA ID. So the FSA ID is your entry point into the FAFSA, how you get in. It's also your exit when you sign. So you'll need a FSA ID for the parents. You'll need one for the student. So the student can't do all this. The parents can't do all this. You have to have one for each, right? So there is a signature. You'll have to read and some additional disclosures and agree to that, specifically because we're talking about money and we're talking about the government. So you will have to agree to certain terms here, and then the student will sign. Then it'll say that it's signed electronically. You'll also go through the parent. Again, parent signatures, and then same disclosure, and you will use your FSA ID to sign. The other thing that you can do here, if you would like, is instead of signing with an FSA ID, you could print a signature page, or you could just withhold your signatures and come back later and sign. Those are options you can do as well. That's not as common though. Most families are really happy to get to this page and they want to get it signed. But those are options that are available to you. Yeah, it's the question is, do you recommend getting an FSA ID for the student and parent now? Absolutely. You can absolutely sign up for it. And if you're in a situation where you have a returning student, like a question that I had answered previously, you can look up your information and you can continue using that FSA ID. So you can, if you've forgotten the password or what have you, you can go through a process to recall those credentials. Good question. All right, so that's the signature page, and then we have the confirmation page. We're essentially through the FAFSA. It will say congratulations, and it will give you a confirmation number. It will give you information on what happens next. And then, by the way, right here, it says expected family contribution, and it gives you a number. So it will give you at least a preliminary, not an FSA ID, an EFC on what the government would expect for your family to contribute per year towards college education expenses. Give you more information on the IRS, and then school kind of data information on the schools you entered in the FAFSA. If you have to go back and do corrections, there is an opportunity to do that. Again, this is kind of that initial dashboard page, and so you can make FAFSA corrections, so you can log back in and correct things if you need to at a later time. There's also, all of this culminates in something called a student aid report, which is a confirmation that you're going to get a few days after the FAFSA, confirming that your information was processed, and it will just say, hey, this is the information that you've listed. At the same time, you get the student aid report, that kind of confirmation at the end of this process, a few days after your FAFSA is processed. The institutions that you put in the FAFSA will also get your financial information. And so they're going to get something called, well, you don't even need to know what it's called, but they'll get a similar form that will report your information as well. So the student aid report, you can log in and look at it in this dashboard page as well. It says view or print your student aid report once your application is processed. And it looks something like this. It's long and it looks more like a confirmation page, but there is some interesting information here if you got like what we call flagged for verification. So if the government thinks something is off on your application, you might be flagged to provide additional documentation to verify what you've listed. And so that can be notated here, your EFC and some of those things, and even some eligibility for aid can be listed here as well. So that's the student aid report. So as we talk about what's next after you fill out the free application for federal student aid, the student will get an email saying that your application is processed, and the government says in a few days. So it should be probably 2 to 3 days, but what that actually means for you might vary. You'll get that confirmation of the student aid report. You can log in and view that. What happens after this is, again, you'll get the student aid report saying that your information is processed. At the same time, all those schools you listed in the FAFSA are going to get your financial information. As long as you've completed their process when it comes to financial aid, again, I told you that there might be additional forms at the school level. They will go about putting together what's called a financial aid letter. And it's one letter saying this is the full cost of attendance of the school. This is all the aid that you've qualified for from the government and the institution itself. And then that's really the only time in this process you'll know what it costs to go to school. What's that check going to look like that you pay to the school itself? These typically come out somewhere between January and May. And you can also, if you want to know some information about where you may fall in terms of affordability for the school, you can go, most colleges are required to have what's called a net price calculator. So you can enter in your information and the school total cost, and then it will give you kind of more of an understanding of what people in your income bracket pay to go to school. Additional resources, if you need help, there is a helpline that the government publishes for the FAFSA, and so you can call and ask questions. This is a great resource for you to use if you get stuck somewhere in the process. You can also go to studentaid.gov. This is hands down the best website on financial aid that's published by the government. I would encourage you to look at that as well. And that's essentially my presentation. I will tell you a couple things. I always get requests to get a PDF of this slide deck, and I have provided that. So if you go to my website, and it looks like we've got somebody I've got to admit here for the last slide. But I do publish the PDF of the slide deck on my website. So gradmetrics.com/workshops. You can find it right there. There's also some recorded previous workshops that I've done for Mid-Continent Public Library and some other places. So you can view those as well if you're interested in that. But I've provided all my contact information here. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me or reach out. You can call or text that number right there. I'm happy to help in the ways that make sense for you. So that's all I've got. I appreciate you all being here. I will stick around for some questions if you have any questions, but it's just great being with you all. Hopefully this has been helpful. And like I said, I'll stick around. Thanks a lot.
Right, and thank you on behalf of Mid-Continent Public Library for attending this Zoom program tonight. And we hope to see you again. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Like I said, I'll stick around if you have a chat or you want to unmute. I'm happy to answer some questions for you here. Yeah, so Pell Grants, good question. So Pell Grants would be for families that demonstrate a lot of financial need. And so these are some of the families that have the lowest income and assets. And so in that case, the government can give grants. And what would happen there is if you qualified with a low EFC, expected family contribution, then that's when you would qualify for Pell Grants. And you would verify that when you got your financial aid letter from the school. The fun thing, and I've seen many financial aid letters that have Pell Grants on them, is a lot of times you'll get that Pell Grant, which I had mentioned is about $6,000 and some change this year. You would get the Pell Grant. A lot of times institutions might even match that Pell Grant and give you additional monies, but that would be outlined for sure in your financial aid letter that you would get from the school. Good question. I graduate high school in 2023. Can I send in an application? So seniors in high school are the ones that fill out the FAFSA because they're going to college. And for instance, our seniors now are going to go to college in 2021, 2022. And so the FAFSA is only open to you if you're going to go to college in the year that the FAFSA is named after. And so generally speaking, you wouldn't be able to fill out the FAFSA. But what I would tell you in that instance is if you're interested to know, am I going to qualify for financial aid? The government publishes a tool called the Fafsa Forecaster. And I'll put that in the chat so you know what it looks like. That's how it's spelled, FAFSA, the number 4, caster, all one word. You can find that on the same web page as the FAFSA, and you can actually, before you're eligible to fill out the FAFSA, fill out some basic information, and the government will give you an estimate of your financial aid. So I find that families find that really helpful if they're not eligible to fill out the FAFSA right now to get an understanding of what they might qualify for in the future. Any other questions for me? Hey, well, if you all need me, contact information is right there. I'm happy to field questions. It's very normal for me to field questions after these workshops conclude from families that just have additional questions. So never feel like you're a burden. If you want to reach out, call or text, happy to help. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to stop the recording and we'll see you all at the next workshop.